be too warm, I might melt. Thank you very much. This lecture is going to be about the history of Christian Zionism. I think it's real important for us to realize how what the history of the church is, because the history of Christianity, of Christendom is a term that refers to everything that relates to Christianity. The cults, Catholic Church, all of this kind of stuff, whether good or bad, anything that relates to Christianity versus the true church of Christ. But what is Zionism? I've been talking about it here. It's simply the desire of the Jewish people to occupy the land of Israel. And the next logical question would be, what is Christian Zionism? And it's simply Christian Zionists, or Christians who desire the Jewish people to occupy the land of Israel. And I consider myself a Christian Zionist because I believe I'm influenced by the Bible on this issue. And, I don't have any good or bad experience with Jewish people because I really didn't hang out around them growing up or anything. But it was my learning of the Bible that, led me to this view. So you have the restoration of Israel in the early church, and as one scholar says, what is singularly absent from early millennial schemes, in other words, in the early church, which was primarily premillennial, or what's called chiliastic, is the motif of the restoration of Israel. The church fathers from the 2nd century on did not encourage any notion of a revival of national Israel. In fact, Justin Martyr, as early as 140, said to Trypho the Jew, he said, the church is the new or true Israel. And what you have then is basically no belief, even in the early church, of the restoration of the Jews to the homeland. And it really wasn't until the early 1800s. As I'll show, the restoration of the homeland, but a distinction between Israel and the church wasn't made till Darby, really, in the early 1800s. But that's something I'll talk about after supper. And so during the medieval church, while medieval eschatology saw a row for the Jews in the future, in other words, becoming Christians, as part of the Gentile church, it was one of subservience. Having been absorbed into the Gentile church, medieval prophetic thought provided no real distinct future for the Jews as a regathered nation of Israel. Certainly little that could be labeled as Zionism. However, toward the end of this era, there were a couple of medievalists who taught some kind of a future for national Israel. In other words, basically just that the Jews would be saved. And Joachim de Fiore is a watershed guy. He dominated the eschatology of beliefs of the Middle Ages. He's the guy that invented historicism, by the way, since we talked about that. And even though some think that Joachim could have been of Jewish descent, his thought is typical of the non-Zionist views of the time. The final conversion of the Jews was a common medieval theme, but one of particular significance to Joachim. It was popular in medieval eschatology to see a future time in which Rome was to be the temporal capital of the world, Jerusalem the spiritual capital. See, the Middle Ages is where you had the development of what's called the Holy Land. It went from being Israel to the Holy Land. When Constantine's mother, Helena, went over for 25 years and identified the holy places, and it was in medieval or Roman Catholic days, it was normal for certain people to go to the Holy Land, to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, but it was viewed as being totally Christian and not identified historically. And so they built Christian holy places there. And so I hope if you go to Israel that you realize the difference between going to Israel and going to the Holy Land. Catholics and Greek Orthodox like to go to the Holy Land. Evangelicals like to go to Israel. So, during the Reformation, the flourishing of millennialism and a belief in a future return of the Jews to their land often go hand in hand. So it's evident as the second generation reformers began to fade. Thus to date, I have not been able to find any reformers who supported the restoration of the Jews back to their land in Israel. Such views must await the post-Reformation era. However, the Reformation in many ways prepared the way for the later rise of Christian Zionist views. The growing importance of the English Bible was a concomitant of the spreading Reformation, and it is true that the Reformation would never have taken hold had the Bible not replaced the Pope as the ultimate spiritual authority. With the Bible as its tool, the Reformation returned to the geographic origins of Christianity, that's what I was saying, in Palestine. It thereby gradually diminished the authority of Rome. You begin to see the shift from the Holy Land to Israel again. Thus, so it would become to be that the provision of the Bible in the language of the people would become the greatest spur of the rise of Christian Zionism. In other words, simply getting the Bible and reading the dang thing. And so the simple provision of the Bible in the native tongue of the people, which gave rise to their incessant reading and familiarization of it, especially the Old Testament, was the greatest soil that yielded a crop of Christian Zionism over time. Just think, in the Middle Ages, only 1,000 to 2,500 people could even read, if they had a book or if they had a Bible. And so you were totally dependent upon what someone else told you the Bible said. Or you could look at the stained glass windows, the 12 Stations of the Cross, or you had communion. And so the average person in medieval Christendom did not know the details of the stories in the Old Testament. They knew the biggies like creation and the fall and Adam and Eve and the flood and some of those stories, you see. But they didn't know the details of the Old Testament. That comes in with the rise of the Puritans. So when both scholars and laymen alike, for the first time in the history of the church, had the text of Scripture, both Old and New Testament. So you really don't have very active study of the Bible for 1,500 years. Yes, you did have it, but it really got going with the Reformation, you see, only 500 years ago, where they finally started studying Hebrew instead of the Latin Vulgate, and finally you started doing Greek. They even neglected the Greek New Testament, and studied it in Latin. And when that was more readily available, it led to greater study, a more literal interpretation, and a greater awareness of Israel in the Old Testament. And this provided the atmosphere in which a major shift occurred in England, also in the continent to a lesser degree, from medieval Jew hatred, which led to the expulsion of all Jews from Britain in 1290. England was the first country in Christendom to expel the Jews completely from their country. In fact, Richard the Lionhearted, who had lived 100 years earlier, was typical of those that would go on crusades. And they would gather people up from Christendom, and as they would gather them up and march toward the Holy Land, they would often go by a synagogue and they would round the Jews up, this literally is true, put them in there and burn them alive in their synagogue and walk around singing something like "Onward Christian Soldiers." We're not taught these things, in our churches, and we don't realize a lot of stuff that was going on during this time. And they thought they were doing God a favor as they went off to, fight the Muslims and get back Jerusalem for Christendom. It wasn't until Cromwell, a Puritan, a premillennialist, in 1655 brought the Jews back from captivity, or from expulsion from England. And Oliver, let's see, I'll talk about it later when I see his picture here. John Owen was the one that preached a sermon in Parliament that won the day. Basically the argument that led to the return of the Jews to England was they thought the Bible taught that the Jews had to be scattered to every country in the world, then they would be regathered to Israel, and then Christ would return. And John Owen won the day with his sermon in Parliament by teaching that England is preventing the second coming because there are no Jews in England. Therefore, they haven't gone to all the countries in the world, and therefore Christ, it can't be regiven to Israel, and Christ can't return. And so Cromwell issued a decree in 1655 to allow the Jews back into England, and Parliament voted money to bring a boatload of Jews from Amsterdam over to England. So it wasn't just any group of English Protestants that provided a fertile soil for Jewish restoration doctrines. It was out of the English Puritan movement that this belief sprung, starting with the Puritan ascendancy. The movement among the English for the return of the Jews to Palestine began. Why the Puritan? Because Puritans were not just dissenters, they were a Protestant sect that valued the Old Testament to an unprecedented degree in their day. This is where you get from Puritanism the idea of Judeo-Christianity. You're certainly not going to get Judeo-Christian ideas from Roman Catholicism, who didn't value the Old Testament or the Jews. So they began to feel, Barbara Tuchman, who wrote a great book called The Bible and the Swords, excellent book, Jewish lady, housewife, wrote this years ago. They began to feel for the Old Testament a preference that showed itself in all their sentiments and habits. They paid a respect to the Hebrew language that they refused, to the language of their Gospels, and to the epistles of Paul. They baptized their children by names not of Christian saints, but of Hebrew patriarchs and warriors. They turned the weekly festival by which the church had, from primitive times, commemorated the resurrection of our Lord into the Jewish Sabbath, Christian Sabbath. I don't agree with it, I'm just telling you this is what they did. They sought for the precedents to guide their ordinary conduct in the book of Judges and Kings. You see, as I was saying earlier, I think I was saying that here, about how England was, being like Israel, being oppressed by all those bad European countries like the Spanish and everything over there. So you have the study of Hebrew. It was revived at Oxford in the late 1300s. You have the translation of the Bible into English. You have the learning of Old Testament stories in detail for the first time. You have Puritans developing Judeo-Christianity, as we've talked about. You have the Bible study that produces premillennialism. In fact, what led to the rise of premillennialism were two key events. Number one was a footnote in the 1559 version of the Geneva Bible in Romans 11 that talked about how Israel had a future, and the statement says something to the effect that just as the Old Testament prophets teach. And secondly, you had in 1587 the rediscovery of the lost 5 chapters of Irenaeus' work from 180. He was an early church father who wrote a book entitled Against Heresy. And his last 5 chapters deal with eschatology, and he's probably the most developed premillennialist in the early church, but because of the medieval oppression of Chiliasm, where they tried to suppress it and change it and do away with it, they had destroyed his last 5 chapters. It was rediscovered, and he taught a very strong premillennialism. That's what began to lead to the rise of premillennialism, which dominated Puritanism, like Cromwell and John Owen actually was post-mill. But the Bible study produces premillennialism, and there are parallel struggles of Israel and England, as I've talked about. Then you have a guy named Francis Kett, who died in 1589, and he had a BA and MA from Cambridge, and he was both a pastor and a medical doctor, and he wrote a book called The Glorious and Beautiful Garland of Man's Glorification concerning the godly mystery of heavenly Jerusalem. And he made the statement in his book, the notion of Jewish national return to Palestine. He had 2 or 3 pages talking about it, and he was burned at the stake on January 15, 1589 in Norwich, England, for producing these comments in his book. for advocating the restoration of the Jews to Israel, an idea he claimed to have received from reading the Bible. Imagine that. Norwich, England at the time was the second largest city in England, and it was where the Jews used to live. And you can read interesting stories about how they massacred hundreds of Jews in a tower, in the 13th century in Norwich. It has a very interesting history related to the Jews there. So you have the English Protestants, and as the 1600s arrived, a flurry of books advocating Jewish restoration to their land began to appear. Thomas Drake released in 1608 The World's Resurrection on the General Calling of the Jews, a familiar commentary on the 11th chapter of St. Paul to the Romans, according to the sense of Scripture. Those great titles there, paragraph-long titles. So Drake argued for Israel's restoration based upon his Calvinism and covenant theology. My, how things have changed. But that is what they did back then. And so as the 1600s arrived, a flurry of books. I already read that. Cut and paste. And here is Thomas Brightman and Joseph Mead. Two, in the early 1600s, Thomas Brightman wrote a commentary on Revelation. He was probably postmillennial. People debate over his postmill or premill. But Joseph Mead, 1621, is called the father of British premillennial, and he was a great intellectual at Oxford. And the two giants of their era, Brightman, as I said, and premillennialist Joseph Mead, both wrote boldly of a future restoration of Israel. Brightman's work, Revelation of the Revelation. Now, Hal Lindsey could have used that title. Revelation of the Revelation, 1609, told how the Jews will return from the areas north and east of Palestine to Jerusalem, and how the Holy Land and the Jewish Christian Church will become the center of a Christian world. And what shall they, the Jews, return to Jerusalem again? There's nothing more certain. The prophecies do everywhere confirm it. So he didn't get killed. It's nice. And Giles Fletcher, a fellow at King's College, Cambridge, and Queen Elizabeth's ambassador to Russia, wrote a work advocating restorationism. Fletcher's books, Israel Redux, or the Resurrection of Israel, or the restoration, of Israel, exhibited in two short treatises, that's a short title, was published posthumously by the Puritan divine Samuel Lee in 1677, but it was written, in the early 1600s, in 1606, and he argues for the return of the Jews to the land, and he repeatedly taught the certainty of the return in God's due time. Sir Henry Finch is a very interesting fellow, a member of Parliament and the most highly respected legal scholar in England. How many of y'all have heard of Blackstone's commentary, legal commentary? Okay. Before there was Blackstone, Finch wrote the first legal commentaries on British law, and Blackstone expanded from Finch. And when Finch was studying Deuteronomy and the Bible and everything, showing where British common law came from, he became interested in the Jews. And he was a Sir Henry Finch. He was knighted. He was this respectable guy, the top of his profession in England. And he published a work entitled The World's Great Restoration, or Calling of the Jews, and with them of all nations and kingdoms of the earth to the faith of Christ. And in it, he seems to have predicted in the near future the restoration of the temporal domain of the Jews and the establishment by them of a worldwide empire. And within 1 or 2 months of that book being published, Finch was thrown into prison by King James, who felt threatened by the prediction that Israel was going to rule the nations. And he, back then when you were put in prison, they didn't even feed you. There were very bad conditions. If you didn't have somebody that brought you food and took care of you, in prison. I'm not saying he didn't, but they were in a very, very bad situation. He died within a year or so of that, and they put his publisher in prison as well, who was a professor at Cambridge. And King Jimmy felt threatened as a result of that. But this was considered the first major extensive book explaining how the Jews would return with all the details and all of this kind of stuff by Sir Henry Finch. And you're wondering, who's that handsome young man there? Well, that's John Owen, who I've already mentioned. And many Puritans of the 17th century taught the restoration of the Jews to the Holy Land, and one of the greatest Puritan theologians in England was John Owen, who was Cromwell's theologian. And he wrote, "The Jews shall be gathered from all parts of the earth, where they are scattered and brought home to their homeland." And here's Cromwell's official document from 1655 that he signed to bring them back. And so you see many 17th century Englishmen who held to the, before it was called Christian Zionism, it was called Restorationism. There was a restoration of the Jews to Israel. So John Milton held it, John Bunyan, Roger Williams, John Sadler, and Oliver Cromwell. The doctrine of the restoration of the Jews continued to be expounded in England, evolving according to the insight of each exponent, and finally playing a role in the Christian Zionist activities in the latter part of the 19th and 20th centuries. So, a similar restoration movement was seen throughout Europe, where the Reformation was strongest, but on a smaller scale. There were a number of restorations in Holland during the time of the Puritan movement. Isaac del Perrier, a linguist here, can correct me on that, please, who served as a French ambassador to Denmark, wrote a book wherein he argued for a restoration of the Jews to Israel without conversion to Christianity, before they were saved, etc. And you have a lot of this going on in Germany and various other places, Switzerland. But let's look at colonial America. Since the American colonies, especially in Puritan New England, were settled primarily by Englishmen who brought with them to the New World many of the same issues and beliefs that were circulating in the motherland, it's not surprising to find many zealous advocates in America for the restoration of the Jews. Perhaps the most influential of the early Puritan ministers in New England was John Cotton, and he was a pastor of the First Congregational Church of Boston, who, following the postmillennialism of Brightman, held to the restoration of the Jews of the Holy Land. In addition to John Cotton, early restorationists include John Davenport, William Hooke, John Eliot, the missionary to the Indians, Samuel Willard, Samuel Sewall, Ephraim Hoot, a Cambridge-trained early minister in Windsor, Connecticut, believed that the Jews would be regathered to their homeland in 1650. Here is Increase Mather. And you have Richard, his father, who was a Cambridge graduate, who immigrated to New England. And Richard Mather tells us in his writings that almost all American Puritans were premillennialists. So that's one of the ways we know this. Don't let anybody try to tell you that the Puritans were postmillennial. That's a popular idea. They weren't. They were premillennial. And Increase Mather was one of the outstanding advocates of the Restoration doctrine, and the son of Richard and the father of Cotton. So Richard married John Cotton's daughter, and they had a son named Cotton Mather. So Cotton Mather was from two elitist families, if you will, John Cotton and the Mather family. Now, Increase was the second president of Harvard, and he wrote over 125 books that were published in his life. He was a slacker, though. We'll see here in a moment. He must have been off playing video games or something, in the forest. And his first work was The Mystery of Israel's Salvation, which was his favorite book that he ever wrote, and it went through 7 or 8 different editions. And his support of the national restoration of Israel to their homeland in the future was typical of American colonial Puritans and was generally widespread. Now, his son Cotton Mather also was a great eschatologist who wrote over 425 books that were published. He wrote many more that weren't. And Time magazine back in 1976 said that the greatest intellectual of the history of America was Jonathan Edwards, but a close second was Cotton Mather. And these people, the Enlightenment had just hit, and these were people that did every field, science and all of this stuff. And apparently they must not have slept back then or anything like that, because they were very productive people. Come from a disciplined culture. So the first salient school of thought in American history that advocated a national restoration of the Jews to Palestine was resident in the first native-born generation at the close of the 17th century, in which Increase Mather played a dominant role. The men who held this view were Puritans, and from that time on, the doctrine of the Restoration may be said to have become endemic to American culture. See, America, it has a Christian foundation. Not just a Christian, but a Protestant Christian foundation. And it did not have the baggage of Europe that had the Roman Catholicism, that was revived later on by Luther and Hitler and some of these other people with their anti-Semitism. And so America is filio-Semitic. I mean, you read Cotton Mather talking about, he has a whole book almost about how he just prays daily that God would allow him to lead a Jewish person to Christ. And he tried many times. You see the passion there that they have. Jonathan Edwards, who was a post-millennialist in the 1700s, talked about how he thought the revival was the beginning of the post-millennial phase, and all they were waiting for was the conversion of the Jews, you see. And he too was hoping for that to occur as well. And so America is different, and that's why you have all the Jews that immigrated between 1870 and World War I. Over 3.5 million Jews immigrated to America, where they were welcome, by and large. And even before that, in the early days, you have some of our founding fathers were Jewish as well. So it was Increase Mather's view that his final and greatest reformation of the Christian world would be led by the Jewish people, ensuing upon their restoration to the Holy Land. From the earliest times, American Christianity has always tilted toward support of the restoration of national Israel in the Holy Land. American Christians, when compared with Euro-Asian Christianity, has always had a filio-Semitic disposition. Thus, it is not surprising that this tradition continues today, especially in dispensational evangelical circles as a whole. Now, it's dying, it's changing, and sure, there's been exceptions to this here and there. You can find in anti-Semites in America, but the overall thrust in culture is different. And if you read the articles like I do, people complaining about, why does America support Israel? And, they complain. Nobody in Europe supports them. And they say if America didn't support Israel, then Israel would cease to exist. And so why does America support Israel? Is it because of the Jewish lobby? And they say, no, it's because of those Christians, those evangelical Christians, you see. It's not because of the Jewish lobby. It's evangelicals who have this belief that the Jews have a destiny or part of God's plan. And so it's evangelicalism in America that is different, that they don't have over in Europe. Now, I've met many Christians in Europe, and they're pro-Israel, but there's just not many of them, you see. Whereas in America, most people believe that Israel should be supported, and it comes from our evangelical heritage, you see. But don't worry, when the rapture occurs, there'll be no support for Israel in America. Then you have dispensationalism. John Nelson Darby, who's really the first true Christian Zionist. The 1800s marks a high point in British premillennialism and a corresponding apex for Christian Zionism. Many contemporary accounts critical of Christian Zionism focus their emphasis upon Darby and the role of dispensationalism as the foundation of the British Restoration. So it's not really true because the Brethren didn't get involved in politics. British Restorationism came from Anglicans, as I've already kind of shown you a little bit there. And the real advocates for Christian Zionism in Britain were primarily Anglican premillennialists. And you go, Anglican Episcopalians were premillennialists? Yes, back in the 1800s. A number of authors, I've seen 3 different people refer to this. They say over 50% of the Anglican clergy in Britain were premillennialists in the 1800s. After the Puritan era in the 1600s, the greatest time of British Christianity is about 1820 to about 1880, where you had a tremendous emphasis on conservative Bible teaching and all of this. And you had even Anglicans, they weren't dispensationalists, but they were premillennialists. And here's a quote. John Murray said, some 700 ministers of the establishment were said to believe that Christ's coming must precede his kingdom on the earth, and that was in 1845. So Murray went on to add that the number almost certainly increased in the latter half of the century. And here's an example. J.C. Ryle, who many have heard of, was a bishop in the Anglican Church. And J.C. Ryle was a big-time premillennialist who wrote a premillennial creed even. Charles Spurgeon signed it, so if there's any doubt, some people try to say Charles Spurgeon was a postmill. No, he signed the premillennial creed. In fact, Thomas Spurgeon, his son, even became a dispensationalist. The wave of premillennialism is what produced in Britain a crop of Christian Zionists that led to the political activism that culminated in the Balfour Declaration. So I believe that this 19th century premillennialism within the Anglican Church, the last gasp breath of it as it was fading was the war cabinet that influenced these people, and after that it's pretty much gone. And so here is Lord Shaftesbury. We hear about William Wilberforce. When Wilberforce passed off the scene, Shaftesbury ascended, and he was probably 5 or 6 times a greater social reformer within British Parliament. He's considered the greatest social reformer in the history of Great Britain. And he was a big-time evangelical Bible-believing Christian. So Anthony Ashley Cooper is said by Barbara Tuchman to have been the most influential non-political figure except Darwin in the Victorian age. As a strong evangelical Anglican, he said to have based his life upon a literal acceptance of the Bible and was known as the evangelical of evangelicals, you see. And this guy here, Edward Bickersteth, I couldn't find a real picture of him. And he was the guy that led Shaftesbury to accept premillennialism, which then gave rise to his views of Jewish restorationism. Shaftesbury said concerning his belief in the second coming, that has always been a moving principle in my life, for I see everything going on in the world subordinate to that great event. In fact, his daughter, Shaftesbury, led the Anglican Church to establish a bishopric in Jerusalem, to send someone over there to protect the Jews in the mid-1800s. And then his daughter went over there with her husband as missionaries to the Jews, Jewish evangelism in Israel. He was big time into this. Because of his premillennialism, Shaftesbury became greatly involved as chairman of the London Society for promoting Christianity among the Jews. And he spearheaded a movement that led to the creation by the Church of England of an Anglican bishopric in Jerusalem with a converted Jew consecrated as its first bishop. Now, that bishop is headed by pro-Palestinian people. You know, that shows you how things have changed. Here's an interesting guy, William Heckler. This guy is funny to read about. The modern Jewish founder of Zionism is recognized to have been Theodore Herzl. His earliest and closest advisor just happened to be the Christian minister William Heckler, who was a zealous Christian Zionist. Reverend Heckler was a pastor who was born in India of German missionary parents, and he attended college in Basel, Switzerland, which is where Herzl was living when he first met him. You know, it's funny, Heckler talks about the first time he met him, he knocks on his door, and, you know, kind of like a vacuum cleaner salesman or something. He doesn't even introduce himself, and he just comes running into Herzl's thing with all these maps of Israel and throws them on the ground and says, "This is what we got to do, you know, to reestablish Israel." And he starts talking about it, and then he says, "Oh yeah, I'm William Heckler," you know, and all this. He was a really focused guy. So Heckler is bilingual in English and German from his childhood, and he was, like his father, a member of the Church of England. And he studied theology in London and then in Tübingen in Germany, which is the center of the liberal approach to Scripture, which he didn't buy. However, he was not persuaded, you know, of this stuff. And this makes sense, as anyone holding to the liberal view of Scripture would not have come to love Israel as did Heckler. And in 1882, he published a book entitled The Restoration of the Jews to Palestine According to Prophecy. In fact, he became chaplain to I think the German king's son, and he built the biggest prophecy library in the world at the time and taught, you know, the Prussian leader, you know, who became king, you know, about Bible prophecy and all of that. In 1885, Heckler was appointed chaplain to the British Embassy in Vienna, and in 1890, he just happens to go wherever Herzl goes, you know, just happened to go. In 1896, Heckler introduces himself to Herzl and thus becomes his most important aide, advisor, and advocate. It was said William Heckler would prove to be not only the first, but the most consistent and the most no, he doesn't get tired, of Herzl's followers. And he got Herzl in to see all of these kings throughout Europe because Heckler knew them, and was a tremendous aid to the early Zionists. And that is Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, a Jewish guy. And they said he looked like a Babylonian king or something like that. Amazing fellow. And he, unbeliever of course, he said in his diary of Heckler, Herzl did, of all the people who have been drawn to me by the movement, the Reverend Heckler is the finest and most fanciful. That's a diplomatic way of saying he's a crazy guy. He frequently writes me on postcards for no particular reason, telling me that he hasn't been able to sleep the previous night because Jerusalem came into his mind. You know, I'm sure the guy'd be texting him and emailing him if he were alive today, you know, talking about Jerusalem. So that's the kind of guy Heckler was, and he played an important role. And here's kind of America's Lord Shaftesbury, William Blackstone. And Blackstone was one of the most outstanding examples of Christian Zionists, is that of American William Blackstone. He was born in Adams, New York, reared in a pious Methodist home, where he became a Christian at age 11. He later became a Presbyterian. When he married and moved to Chicago, became a very successful businessman. And even though he was a Methodist initially, he had become motivated by the dispensational view of the Bible prophecy to work for the reestablishment of national Israel. And he was a tireless, self-taught student of Bible and theology and became very interested in what the Bible had to say about Israel. And like many Christians with similar interests, this led to attempts to evangelize Jewish people with the gospel. And in 1887, he founded the Chicago Hebrew Mission for the Evangelization of Jews, the oldest continuous Jewish evangelism organization in America. And this is something you see in America. Most of these guys who got involved in pro-Israel stuff first got involved in trying to evangelize the Jews. And he wrote a book called Jesus is Coming. And in 1908, it sold over 1 million copies in 3 editions. That's for Hal Lindsey, you know. And probably no dispensational Bible teacher of his time had a larger popular audience. He tried to get, twice, he got all of these congressmen and senators and stuff, and judges and things, important people, to write petitions and send to the president, you know, to try to advocate for the founding of the nation of Israel. One time I read that he often spoke to Jewish people, and he had like He spoke to 9,000 Jewish people once, and he preached the gospel, and he even gave an altar call. Can you imagine that? Giving an altar call to these were Orthodox Jews, all sitting there in their black stuff. He was another kind of crazy guy, but you have to be half crazy to believe this stuff. And another crazy guy, the Cussing Baptist, Harry Truman. Let's hear it for him. And President Harry S. Truman grew up in Missouri in a devout Christian home, Southern Baptist. When Harry was born, his parents were attending the Southern Baptist Church, with both sides of grandparents had helped establish in Grandview, Missouri. His father, John Anderson Truman, was also a strong Baptist. Both his father and mother, Martha, raised him in the conventional Baptist tradition. He must have had other influences in his life other than the Baptist church, but while growing up, Truman read the Bible through twice by age 12 and 2 more times by age 14 from Sunday school and his own reading of the Bible. He knew many biblical passages by heart and could quote many Bible verses at random. And young Harry was an avid reader and remained so throughout his life. And the Truman family owned a set of Great Men and Famous Women edited by Charles Francis Horn, which are his favorite books. And according to Truman's daughter, Margaret, he preferred after those biographies was the Bible. Well, at least it was second place there. There's even an indication that Truman considered entering the ministry for a time, and even every indication reveals that Harry and his sister Mary were very active in the church throughout their late teens and early 20s. So Truman's Christian Zionism was a combination of his attraction to the people of the Bible, the Jews, that grew out of his familiarity of biblical details with humanitarian concern for persecuted people. And he was kind of like Lord Balfour, who felt the Jews were owed something by Christendom. It wasn't his eschatology or Bible prophecy that led to that, because he clearly was not, didn't know much about Bible prophecy. So he said the stories of the Bible, said Truman, were to me stories about real people. That's nice. And I felt I knew some of them better than actual people I knew. I like that. I guess that's where the expression, he's not a real person, or he is a real person, may have came from. His Christian Zionist beliefs were well developed and deeply rooted long before he became president of the United States. In fact, when he was a senator, and they had a boat of Jewish refugees before World War II that no one would take, he led the Senate to pass a resolution to let that boat in. In other words, he was probably the most outstanding pro-Israel senator back then. And President Counsel Clark Clifford tells us that Truman's own reading of ancient history in the Bible made him a supporter of the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, even when others who were sympathetic to the plight of the Jews were talking of sending them to places like Brazil. He did not need to be convinced by Zionists. In other words, he was lobbied all the time by Zionists, and he says, they didn't need to lobby me. All in all, he believed that the surviving Jews deserved some place that was historically their own. And I remember him talking once about the problem of repatriating displaced persons. Everyone else who's been dragged away from his country had some place to go back to, Truman said, but the Jews had no place to go. So Truman's Christian Zionism came into play during two of his greatest decisions that he would make during his presidency. First, how should the U.S. vote on the partition of Israel, which would result in the creation of the new Jewish state during the United Nations vote in late November 1947 in San Francisco. That's where the UN was originally. And secondly, should the U.S. diplomatically recognize the newly formed nation when David Ben-Gurion declared the birth of Israel on May 14, 1948. There he is. And so what you have is, on both issues, virtually all of Truman's personal advisors, the State Department, the military establishment, were opposed to him. Truman's most trusted foreign policy advisors, almost to a man, were dead set against the establishment of a Jewish state of Palestine. The president faced the formidable front of General Marshall, Under Secretary of State Robert Lovett, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, Policy Planning Staff George Kennan, State Department Counsel Charles Bolin, and Marshall's successor, Secretary of State Dean Acheson. In other words, all of these hangovers from the Roosevelt administration were opposed to this. And so you have Lloyd Henderson, director of the NEA, who had arrived at the State Department just 3 days after FDR's death, also opposed the Zionist aims. William Yale, also at the State Department, said that the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine would be a major blunder in statesmanship. When Secretary Forrestal reminded the president of the critical need for Saudi Arabian oil in the event of war, Truman said he would not handle the situation. He would handle the situation in light of justice, not war. Now, I have a doctoral dissertation from Stanford, the Hoover Institute, and it's a whole evaluation of would FDR had recognized Israel if he had remained president. And absolute consensus that he would not have. A new book has come out on Harry Truman. It also has 2 chapters on would FDR have recognized Israel. No, he wouldn't have. Everybody believes that. And I'm suggesting this could be why God took out FDR and he put the old Cussing Baptist in, who FDR had only talked to twice in his entire life before he became president, because FDR died 30 days into his 4th term, if you recall. And so here's Harry Truman. He didn't even know about the Manhattan Project and all these other things. All of a sudden he becomes president. And just like in Britain with the Balfour Declaration, just so happened, Calvinist luck, that the right guy was in office to recognize Israel, a guy who is known for his character. The buck stops here, who didn't mind spitting into the wind, Harry Truman. And here is his recognition of Israel after Israel declared itself to be a nation. Within 17 minutes, before any of his advisors could get to him, he issued this statement. He ran to the Rose Garden and recognized Israel as a nation. And there's the official declaration that you have. So Clark Clifford said of President Truman's decision to favor Israel the following observation: as a student of the Bible, he believed in the historic justification for a Jewish homeland, and it was a conviction with him that the Balfour Declaration of 1917 constituted a solemn promise that fulfilled the age-old hope and dream of the Jewish people. And after his presidency, his lifelong Jewish friend, Eddie Jacobson, who he went into business with at one time in a haberdashery somewhere in Missouri, I can't remember, Independence, Missouri, the capital, was introduced to a group of professors by saying, "This is the man who helped create the state of Israel." But Truman corrected him. "What do you mean, helped create? I'm Cyrus. I'm Cyrus." So here's a guy who knew his Bible, and he saw himself as a modern Cyrus who brought the children of Israel back to their land, as Cyrus the Persian did after the first dispersion. Truman was comparing himself, well, what he said that. I kind of wonder if he didn't throw in a few adjectives there. But God has greatly used many Gentile Christians during the last few hundred years that have prepared the way for Israel's return to their land. And God will continue to use believers in the future who trust his prophecies about a national future for his people, Israel. Yet today, there are a growing number of voices saying that we are dangerous, heretical, and our influence should be resisted. The danger isn't going away, declares Gershon Gornberg. He's a liberal Jewish guy that's written about how conservative Jews, conservative Muslims, conservative Christians, are going to cause World War III or IV or something like that. And he says, not as long as people think that they know what God has to do next and where he has to do it, and are terribly impatient for him to begin. So here is the Greek Orthodox bishop in a Vatican body. He asked UN to end Israeli occupation. He said, "We Christians cannot speak about the promised land for the Jewish people. There is no longer a chosen people. All men and women of all countries have become the chosen people. The concept of the promised land cannot be used as a base for the justification of the return of Jews to Israel and the displacement of Palestinians," he added. The justification of Israel's occupation of the land Palestine cannot be based on sacred scriptures. So of course they want to remove scripture from this, but nevertheless, God is sovereign, and God knows how to put his people at the right time in the right place to bring about his plans. And so I think it's encouraging to see, as we often feel like we're minorities and we're insignificant, like we're a speck of dust, on sand, and don't have any influence, that God is working in history, and he can use us, to reach individuals here, individuals there, and he is going to work his plan out. Let's pray. Father, we thank you so much.